Ok, bueno, buenos días, tardes a todos. Hoy vamos a iniciar con otra plática que tiene mucha relevancia para el tema del hackathon. Hoy tenemos a Lauren Sadow, que es investigadora postdoctoral en el proyecto Danish in the Making de la Universidad de Aarhus. No sé si lo pronuncié bien, pero bueno, en la Universidad de Aarhus en Dinamarca, que es donde ella trabaja como investigadora, lingüista, lexicógrafa y programadora. La principal área de investigación de Lauren es la descripción y la enseñanza de la cultura invisible en las lenguas, especialmente para estudiantes de idiomas. Y para ello, Lauren desarrolla diccionarios específicos que, por ejemplo, uno de los diccionarios que ella creó fue el Australian Dictionary of Invisible Culture for Teachers. Esto me parece que es uno de sus proyectos más recientes y ese diccionario está en línea desde el 2021 y está desarrollando una segunda versión del mismo que estará disponible para finales de este año. Solo una especificación, Lauren va a dar su charla en inglés. Hizo todo el esfuerzo por incluir slides que estén en inglés y en español. Entonces, pues esperemos que no les sea muy difícil de seguirla. En caso de que quieran hacer una pregunta a Lauren, no se preocupen por hacerle la pregunta en inglés, le pueden hacer la pregunta en español y ya sea María o yo se la podemos hacer en inglés. Entonces, bueno, pues thank you very much, Lauren, for being here. And let me share your slides. And as soon as I think it's right? So I think it works. Okay, so as soon as you're ready, we can go ahead.
Okay, let's go.
Okay.
Right. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Diana. And thank you, Diana and Maria, both for organizing this event. As Diana mentioned, I am Lauren Sadow. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Aarhus University in Denmark, but I come originally from Australia. I do many, many things in my work, but I was mostly trained as a linguist, as a semanticist and pragmatist, working within the natural semantic metalanguage framework. And that's what I'm going to talk mostly about today. So today, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about linguistic and cultural bias, both in NLP, natural language processing frameworks, and also within descriptions of culture and how these two problems play off one another, and then talk about the natural semantic metalanguage and how we can use this to describe culture while avoiding linguistic bias. And then to finish off, I'll talk about some ideas and ways that this can be applied to large language models. And I look forward to hearing other people's feedback and input on what they think the natural semantic metalanguage and cultural scripts can be used for when it comes to natural language processing. Just to start off and make sure that we're all on the same page, I thought I'd give a little bit of a comment about what is culture and what are we talking about when we talk about culture. So obviously, most people are aware of the type of culture where we talk about religion and festivals and really visible things like the food that we eat, the way that we gesture to one another, things that people often see in the media, for example, but are often commented on in other kinds of frameworks. But culture goes a lot deeper than that. It's not just the things that we see, but it is an entire framework in which all individuals live their life. We often generalize culture to being based on one country or another country, but culture is actually so much more complex than that. It's not necessarily tied to an individual language, place, age group, or gender, but all of these things interact with one another in many different ways. So in brief, culture is a vague concept that covers societal norms, the different symbolic systems that we adhere to, like religion, different practices, and a whole lot more. And all of these elements play out in the way that we interact with one another. So the picture on the right, the right of this slide is the iceberg. And the iceberg model is often used to describe culture because the part above the surface, all the things that we see and that we often think about, is only one small component of what culture actually is. And all of the things that are underneath the water are the underpinning elements which support the visible aspects. And those are things like the values that we hold, the way that we think about different things, the different considerations we make when choosing how to interact with one another, for example, different laws, different values and ideologies that underpin those laws, and so on. The other important thing to note is that culture is not static. It changes over time. There are many different factors which influence which cultural values are more prominent in one time or another. And of course, we are all familiar with the generational cultural change that happens, and that is much discussed online. The final part that I'd like to mention about culture is that because of the different parts of culture that interact with one another, culture can be thought of as something that's quite individual. The ways that we behave and the cultures that we adhere to can be combined in such specific ways, the subcultures, the subgroups, the ways that we, the people that we talk to can be combined in such individualistic ways that each individual comes out as being unique. But culture still forms a framework of knowledge that we have and behavioral skills that we have that allows us to interact with other groups of people appropriately, depending on the context. And when we're talking about cultural alignment with LLMs, it's this choosing the correct framework and the correct ways of interacting that is what we're trying to improve with the responses from these LLMs. So to start with, I wanted to talk a little bit about linguistic and cultural bias. I'm sure that all of you have heard about and know a lot about the English language bias and the English or Anglo-cultural bias in large language models. There's a couple of really key reasons for this. The first one, of course, is that so much of the training data from the internet was in English. A huge proportion of information on the internet is in English, that it obviously biases in that way. But more nuanced than that is the fact that because English is used as a common language all over the world, there are many different varieties of English that have been used, and there's no nuance between those different varieties. So there's been no kind of narrowing down of the different cultures that have been expressed throughout the English language models, data, sorry. The second one is just the way that large language models work. When that amount of data goes into the models, of course, the statistical prediction comes out based on that data. So that means, of course, that the most likely next token in the sequence is going to be based on the English language data, thus producing culturally biased outputs. And the third thing that I was thinking about while preparing this presentation was the difference between a prompt as a query and utterance and an utterance as an input. So if most large language models are trained with a chatbot in mind, where a user inputs a query and the return is an answer about that query, then the chatbot or the model is going to be more likely to produce correct answers without using the correct language of that particular speech culture or lingua culture. So to my knowledge, fewer models are trained using utterance as input, which would then be about producing the linguistically nuanced response. But simply from the idea of producing knowledge, it changes immediately the types of answers and the cultural nuance that the LLMs are primed to give. The second part of bias that I want to mention is the inherent bias that exists in cultural descriptions. So a lot of the ways that people talk about culture, particularly in linguistic and cultural research, inherently is pinned on different terms in English, such as politeness, formality, seniority, equality, and other terms like this. The problem with using words like this is that it embeds Anglo-cultural values into the language that is being used to describe other cultures. So an English speaker's version of polite, an understanding of the word polite, doesn't necessarily map onto other languages' understandings, which can then lead to a kind of slippage in meaning and in appropriateness of utterances when we assume that polite is the same. This doesn't necessarily mean that these concepts or very similar concepts don't exist in these other lingua cultures, in these other cultures, but just that we shouldn't take for granted that they do. There are many other approaches to cultural description. I've listed two here on this slide, two very well-known ones. But these approaches to culture also fall into this trap of using English, or mostly being talked about using these English-specific terms. So Brown and Levinson, their face theory, politeness theory, they talk about face-saving and face-threatening acts. And these terms, saving has an inherent positive value, threatening an inherently negative one, and this influences how we think about these different kinds of acts in an interaction. Likewise, Hofstadter's cultural dimensions uses terms like collectivist and individualist, indulgence and restraint. All of these are very Anglo terms which package these ideas about how to think about one another or how to think about what you're doing in accordance to what is right and wrong or positive and negative within the English-speaking worldview. And this comment at the bottom is from me that English is widely accepted as a default because it's become that default international language. But unfortunately, using English to describe culture in this way leads us straight back into that trap that we're trying to avoid with these large language models to give them better and more accurate cultural alignment. And I've used English here as an example because it is the most significant issue when describing culture. But the same issue happens whenever we use similar terms in any other language. I know this hackathon is targeted at Spanish speakers. And as a result of using Spanish, you would come across these same issues as well. So then, how do we describe culture while avoiding linguistic bias? As I mentioned in my introduction, one way of doing this comes out of linguistic research, primarily in Australia, by a Polish-Australian linguist called Anna Wierzbicka and her colleagues like Cliff Goddard, Bert Peters, Zhengdao Ye, and many, many others. They've been working on something called the natural semantic metalanguage, which is a way of describing language and culture, so particularly the meaning of words, semantics, and how words and language are used in their context, pragmatics, using the simplest possible words. And using just this simple set of words, which can be translated into any language accurately without losing that meaning, by doing this, we can more accurately describe culture and cultural elements without losing that meaning to the different layers added by using more complex words. So the 65 concepts can be expressed in any language. at least that is any language that's been tested under the research program so far. We have 27 listed on our website, nsm-approach.net. And there's been some research conducted on many, many more. And these research projects have covered all language groups, from the European languages to Native American languages, Native Australian languages, languages of East and Southeast Asia, Arabic, Hebrew, and so on. So these terms that you can see on the slide now are known as semantic primes. They are the simplest possible concepts, so they cannot be explained using any simpler words. And this principle comes from the lexicographic golden rule, that is to say, the golden rule of writing definitions, that you should always explain a term in words more simple than the term being explained. These words here cannot be explained using simpler words. You will always have to go to more complex words to explain them. These words here listed in English represent the concepts. Now, it's the concepts that are the semantic primes, not the words themselves. So these concepts are expressed in English mostly as words, but in other languages can be expressed as affixes, as case markings, other non-word alternatives. But the core concept is the same in being able to be expressed. Words or ways of expressing these primes can often be polysemous. That is, they often have additional meanings on top of the concept that is the semantic prime. So for an example from this slide, we have the word like in the bottom right-hand corner. Like in English has at least two meanings, such as I like chocolate, and an orange is shaped like a ball. Now, the first one of these meanings is not a semantic prime. It's only the meaning an orange is shaped like a ball that is the semantic prime concept. So to use the word like as in I like chocolate would be a non-semantic prime use. Also on this diagram, you might see some tildes, the curly line separating words. This curly line indicates something called allelexes. And these are words which have the same meaning, but appear differently based on the context in which they are expressed. So in the top left-hand corner, there's something and thing. Sometimes it's appropriate in English to say something, and sometimes that sounds very strange, and so you just use thing. Likewise with when and time. When is it happening and what time is it are two different ways of expressing the same time concept, but the context determines which word must be used. And when we're talking about semantic primes, depending on the context, there can be many, many allelexes. In some common allelexes include case markings. For example, in English, I give him something versus he gives me something. So I and me, he and him represent allelexes of the same concept. I've also included here a version of these semantic primes in Spanish for the Spanish speakers. You'll notice that we've just left the verbs in the infinitive, but of course the verbs would be conjugated in the correct ways to use them in sentences. So within the natural semantic metalanguage, these semantic primes are then connected into components and descriptions and definitions, which reflect those cultural values that I talked about earlier. But these semantic primes are not really enough to form a meta-language to talk at that next level about language. So there is an associated grammar that goes along with these primes. And this is demonstrated in this very small chart, which can be found again on that website that I mentioned. The associated grammar is formed by the different combinatorial patterns of each semantic prime. So that includes the grammatical forms, cases, genders, and prepositions that connect ideas to one another. We can zoom in here into one of the squares to see some of those phrases. So in the box that says do, there is the frame or the combinatorial pattern, someone does something to someone else. So this gives you an idea of which meaning of do is the word, is the concept, which is the semantic prime. And it gives you an idea of the translatable patterns which this prime allows for. Because of course, many languages, many different dialects even, can do things with words in different ways to one another. And what we've tried to do throughout this research program is find only those ways which can be translated accurately into as many languages as possible. Okay. So from here, I want to talk about how we use these to explain values, beliefs, and attitudes. So what we call these explanations of values, beliefs, and attitudes is what's termed cultural scripts. These go alongside the semantic element that I mentioned earlier, called semantic explications. But the cultural scripts describe how people think, or how people can think. And while they can seem like rules, they're not designed to describe how all people think. And they often have really close, nuanced elements to them, which specify exactly how widespread this way of thinking is. So there's differences, like you can see on this slide, between many people think like this versus some people think like this versus people can think like this versus I think like this. Because there are only 65 semantic primes, the precise word choice is really, really important with these cultural scripts. And that difference between many people versus some people is a really significant comment to make about the cultural script being described. Other features of cultural scripts often include value judgments. So things like, it is good if somebody does this. It's good if I can think like this. It is bad if people, many people, some people think this is good. And then something that I've looked at a bit with these cultural scripts is the different kinds of interpretations that we can have. And this can be really useful, I think, for the large language model alignments, where we can reframe the same cultural scripts as being for intention. So when I want to say something, when I want somebody to feel a particular way or to think a particular way, it is good if I say this, it is bad if I say this. Flipped around to the other side, to the listener's perspective, we can have, when someone says to me, I can know, I can think like this, I can feel like this, I can do this. And then there's a more script-like approach, like a stage script, which I call interaction, where you can have speaker one says, I think like this, which is a map or a placeholder for whatever the actual phrase is. And then John replies, I don't think like this. So I don't think what Mary thinks. I think like this. Again, a placeholder for John's actual opinion. And in this way, cultural scripts can be used as templates for interaction, templates for understanding a speaker coming to you, and templates as well for creating dialogue, creating an utterance which adheres to those cultural nuances that we're trying to get at. So, an example of a cultural script. I've put a few examples in here, but of course there is a lot of research out there and a lot in many different languages. I've just chosen some short ones that are convenient to look at on slides and a video like this one. So this example here is an interactional strategy from Australia, or from Australian English, for softening disagreement with partial agreement. Now, the thing I like about this one is that this introductory phrase is very technical. It's quite difficult to understand if you're not familiar with the linguistic research that goes into a phrase like this, or you're not really focusing on what the individual words actually mean to play out in interaction. But on the other hand, the natural semantic metalanguage description of this interaction is much more straightforward, I think. And it goes, many people in Australia think like this. When I want to say to another person about something, I don't think about it like you. It is good to say something like this at the same time. I think about some of these things like you. I don't think about all of these things like you. As you can see, these parts in quotations are not literal things that somebody would say. Instead, this is what we say is a paraphrase. So it's the message that somebody is giving regardless of the actual words that they are saying. So you can imagine how you might substitute these expressions with something like, when I want to say to another person about something, I disagree, pineapple on pizza is terrible. It is good to say something like this at the same time. I think about some of these things like you. So you might say, I agree that there are some situations where pineapple is delicious. I don't think about all these things like you, but I can't agree that pizza is one of those places. And that's how these cultural scripts move back towards, or can be interpreted again for an interaction rather than a generalized script. In this script, you may notice particular words like to. It is good to say something like this at the same time. These words weren't on the list of 65 semantic primes, but this is what I meant by the grammatical connector words coming from those construction possibilities from the chart before. It's those combinatorial patterns that determine the use of, in English, it's often prepositions, but it may be cases, genders, etc. in different languages. So another version of a cultural script, another Anglo one, is one here about how to say please. So many people here think like this. So this is a generalization about saying please in English, but it is not everybody who thinks that this way. When someone wants to say to someone else something like this, I want you to do something, a request, it is good if this someone says one word to this other someone at the same time. That is at the same time as saying the I want you to do something utterance. And then it says, this word is please. So quite a straightforward guideline for when and how to say the word please. Of course, it could be more detailed and more nuanced, but this is very easily generalized across a range of different types of situations. And when we're looking at the different kinds of cultural scripts, some are very high level in that they influence a lot of different kinds of interactions, and some are very, very nuanced. So they might be really specific, like the previous example, about softening disagreement with partial agreement, you can see that that would only apply in a situation where you need to express disagreement to somebody that you don't want to offend. On the other hand, ideas and values about freedom, democracy, free speech, so on, would be much, much higher level and influence many other aspects of interaction rather than just this one situation. So the term for this in NSM research is master scripts or high-level scripts. And then there are kinds of gradations, if you will, about the different kinds of interactions or different nuance levels in interactions. One final example here is an example of how these cultural scripts can be used to compare different cultures. This example is from Danish and Australian, well, Anglo-cultural script, probably more American, where you can see that the lines are the same apart from what I have highlighted as the key differences in pink. And this demonstrates how, even though these lingua cultures are considered quite similar to one another, we can illustrate the differences at this kind of nuanced level. So when you're in a place for a short time with someone else, if you don't know well who this someone is, in one, it is good if this someone doesn't want to say many things, and in the other, it not it is good, but it can be good if this someone wants to say some things. And again, these nuances between whether it is good versus it can be good, it wants, doesn't want, say some things versus say many things, these are all nuances about the precise level of interaction that's being captured in these cultural scripts, and is one of the really powerful things about writing cultural scripts using the natural semantic metalanguage. Now I'll just speak briefly about how to write cultural scripts and how the data collection and process for doing that goes, just in case anyone is interested in looking more deeply into this. So in research in the natural semantic metalanguage, we use data sources from a wide variety of places, from ethnographic observations, transcripts and recordings, linguistic corpora, and ethnographic interviews, which is to say we talk to native speakers and ask them about different interactions, and basically anything that collects data about cultures and how people interact with one another is valid data for writing cultural scripts. I like to think about the natural semantic metalanguage not as a rock solid way of doing all kinds of research, but a really well thought through way of summarizing research findings and consolidating those research findings into cross-translatable language that can be interpreted by speakers of the language. So different ways that you can collect data and different steps that you can use to question your data and think about the different elements to write cultural scripts are these steps. So these steps come from a book by Bert Peters, published in 2024 in French. It's called Langue, Culture et Valeurs. And these come from the English translation in a paper by Peters, myself, Goddard, and Mullen, which will come out later this year. So these 7 steps start with finding that hard evidence. So are there testimonies? Are there examples of people talking about this interaction that you're interested in describing? Are there examples of people from within the lingua culture talking about the interactions? So this could be blogs, this could be radio shows or podcasts, it could be Reddit comments, there could be innumerable ways, newspaper articles. And then are there external perspectives coming from foreigners who have either settled or not in the country? So, for example, travel blogs or novels written by people who've settled there, questions on different forums, and so on. And then what non-linguistic indications are there of this behavior or of this cultural phenomenon? Can you see it in the media, literature, slogans, mottos, advertising messages, movie posters, so on and so forth? The second step is to find how this plays out in language. So are there any particular keywords or phrases that are used? Are there any collocations, set expressions, or common phrases that allude to it? So is there a saying about, for example, children should be seen and not heard, which says something about Anglo speakers valuing silence or at least not screaming from children? The third step is about highlighting the communicative norms rather than just the word-based ones. So what are the underlying ideals about how people should communicate to one another, with one another, that governs how people are acting out this behavior? So the idea that people should speak respectfully to one another might govern the use of particular polite forms. And then what is the relationship between those two standards? So what is the relationship between the norm of being respectful and using polite forms? Is it closely aligned? Is there some difference? Is one situationally governed more than the other? Generalization, so on. Step 4, are there any other related communicative behaviors, and do they adhere to the same communicative norms? So how are they related? How broadly does this go? In the first example about expressing disagreement with partial agreement, that's attached to different values and different ways of expressing your opinion. So there are more related communicative behaviors about how to express agreement with somebody, or how to express strong disagreement with somebody, or how to express disagreement when you do want to offend them, and so on. Step 5 and 6 is where the natural semantic metalanguage comes in. So once you've collected all of this data and you have ideas about answering all of these questions, this is where you try to put it into the simpler language and try to prioritize the different elements into some kind of a structure that would make sense for a native speaker. And that includes the explanation of communicative norms that underlie how the behavior functions. So when we're talking about cultural scripts, this is the different layers of cultural scripts that I was referring to before. The communicative norm is the higher level one that influences different communicative behaviors, and the behavior is the fine-grained one influencing specific types of situations. There are other steps after this in the paper that I've borrowed this from, but those steps go on to how articulating one of these communicative norms will lead you into thinking and talking about the values which govern these and the related norms and behaviors that spread out to different kinds of interactions, different situations, different kinds of contexts and people that you are speaking to. And as I said, I'll just finish with some thinking about some ideas for cultural alignment. Now, hopefully, the idea that the cultural scripts that I have shown you give some kind of clear indication of how they might be used for large language models. But to be more explicit about it, I think that these cultural scripts could be really powerfully used as as tools to describe, as rules to input in fine-tuning a model. They provide the different kinds of contexts, the different kinds of relationships between speakers. You could use the natural semantic metalanguage to rewrite many of the tagged elements in a consistent way that could then also be translated across languages without any loss of that meaning. So that's one of the other elements that I think is really powerful with the natural semantic metalanguage and cultural scripts, because the idea is that it is translatable across languages. We hope that, and initial research is finding very positive results, that when we use automatic machine translation on these descriptions of culture and interaction, they are very accurately translated with very minor errors in them compared to the more complex linguistically oriented discussions of culture. So this hopefully means that an LLM will be able to apply the correct rules in the correct situations, providing that the input database or the data structure is detailed enough and accurately enough done. Now, I asked ChatGPT about creating such a database, and this is one of the examples that it gave me after some tweaking. But in this knowledge base template that it gave me, you can see some of the you can see some of the English language terms which are perhaps not culturally translatable in very many ways. And perhaps, hopefully, you can see some of the Anglo influences which would benefit from adding the natural semantic metalanguage. So in the second line, for example, it already says indirect request to senior. And this idea of an indirect request is already an Anglo term which could be expressed differently using the natural semantic metalanguage. Same with the different speech acts, the speaker roles, listener roles, and so on. The description of the rules, of course, could be like the cultural scripts that I mentioned, and the different exceptions could, again, be expressed using the natural semantic metalanguage. So this has been a very quick, considering the depth of information that I've given you, a very quick overview of cultural scripts and describing language and culture using cross-translatable language. I hope that it makes some kind of sense, and I look forward to the questions that I'll get from you. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. I think it was a very interesting presentation. So far, we don't have any questions on the chat. I don't know if Maria wants to comment on anything, but for me, it was a nice overview.
Yeah, definitely. It's super interesting. And also, I really like the last reflection you did about how it being easier, like more easy to translate or like to machine translate, would also make it a bit more well suitable for LLMs. Sorry, this is kind of loud, I think. Yeah, so actually, I would have a question or more about like just asking about resources. Of course, your dictionary, and also we'll keep an eye for the second one you're going to publish. Would you have like more ideas or like, yeah, more ideas about resources or like how we could find examples of this cultural scripts? Because I think it's definitely something that the participants or us in our research could use.
Yeah, so the best resource is the website nsm-approach.net. That website is basically a database of publications using this approach, and you can search on that database for publications which focus on different languages. You can focus on different, you can search for different ideas that's the one. Thank you. You can look for different authors, for example. There are lots of different ways that you can search, and that should find you not quite everything, but most and certainly all of the big publications that have happened since 1982.
Okay, wow, that sounds like quite a database. Yeah, love it. Thank you very much. We'll definitely have a look.
I should also say that that website is where you can find the diagrams like the ones that I showed in the presentation, and there's charts for a couple of different languages. There are more tables. You can download Word documents of the semantic primes in different languages. That's where the 27 different languages are. And yeah, there's a whole lot of resources and different things on that site. So there should be plenty.
What you showed in your last slide, did you say that it's something that ChatGPT generated?
Yes.
So you prompted the model, and all those rules were generated by ChatGPT?
Yes. So it was a very long... I spent a lot of time interacting with ChatGPT, going backwards and forwards and talking about ideal ways. So it was pulling together a lot of different ideas. The prompt was very complex by the time I got to this.
Mm-hmm.
But this came from, both I was asking it questions and getting it to explain concepts, and then feeding back questions and issues that I saw in the responses that it gave me, and building things in that way. So it chose Japanese as an example language. I didn't ask for that. It just chose that.
Yeah, I noticed the Japanese part. So, and for example, I mean, Japanese is a quite interesting example for making requests, because in Japanese there's like different hierarchies, and what is annoying about Japanese is that depending on who you're talking to, so there's the concept of someone that is above you, someone that is at your level, and someone who is below you, which usually is animals and children. So definitely someone that is above you is like a professor or someone that's older. And for example, in Spanish, we will tend to change our tone, but in Japanese, you will use a completely different word, which implies like the hierarchy. And for example, in here it says sumimasen, which is like the base. It's pretty much saying excuse me, which it will not be accurate, for example, for a higher hierarchy. So yeah, like those kind of things, like those kind of nuances, I guess like that's the kind of thing like a language model doesn't really grab well.
Yes. And from my understanding, the way that models like ChatGPT and so on deal with Japanese is very, very poorly. Those nuances that you were talking about are some of the real things that it's struggling with. Again, but I think that using the natural semantic metalanguage to help determine what those levels and what that hierarchy is, and to provide some kind of a rule-based framework for the LLM to access and operate within would really help.
So you were talking about cultural scripts. So for example, in this case, do you think it will be better to use a script that like about an interaction for making a request, for example?
I think that any kind of interaction would rely on many different cultural scripts. So never just a single one. Maybe never is a bit of an exaggeration, but probably very rarely just a single one. So you would have to have overlapping cultural scripts for how to speak to people above you, how to make a request, what size is the request, what's the context in which you're asking somebody, what's your position in relationship to them, and how does that change the types of ways that you interact. How would you, I mean, I guess there's some elements of how well you know the person as well as that hierarchy.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, Japanese was just an example. With in the case of Spanish,
I mean, in any interaction, even in English or in French.
Yeah,
Spanish.
but like something that comes to mind, and for example, so I'm from Mexico, Maria is from Spain, and I think people from Mexico at least tend to have the idea that people in Spain are rude, but it's because I think the request example is a good one, because like in the way that we make requests, like in the rough translation in English, is like we tend to say something as like, could you give me this? And I think Spain is more like, give me this. And in our case, if you just say that, it sounds like rude. It's just, which is not rude, it's just more direct. But in our culture, that we are taught to be, like a bit more soft. So then, at least, for example, like the first time I traveled to Spain, like my parents were, I guess, particularly my parents, I guess as a teenager, I didn't care that much. But for them, I think they felt a bit more attacked with that way of speaking.
I think that's totally true. It also depends like where in Spain you are, like north, south, middle, south. It also depends. Um, but yeah, also being in Latin America, I feel like everybody is much more, yeah, soft as you say, like with the requests. Yeah, totally, totally.
Yeah. And I think this is why the perspective of culture that I mentioned at the beginning is so important, because there's a kind of default of associating cultures with countries or languages, but of course there's so much variation within that, and people talk about dialectal variation, like the different words that people use all the time, but of course there's that cultural variation as well, the different ways of making requests, the different considerations with relationships, and that can be not just within a language or a country, but within even smaller groups than that as well, like right down to the city and family level.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So for example, like what tends to happen, like the most simple way to play with this with the LLM is, like in the prompt, you're able to define a role. So you can tell the LLM like, okay, you are going to be a person from Mexico City. I mean, you can be as specific as you want, right? So you can say you're going to be a male person from Mexico City, and you are interacting with a customer in a store. I don't know, something like that. And then you give that instruction, you are defining the role, so then you're expecting the LLM to reply accordingly, right? So then you will expect the LLM in this kind of situation, then if it is from Mexico, to not be as direct as opposed to Spain, for example. So I think this is the easiest way of playing with it, but I guess the prompt and the role could be, and I guess it could include some elements from the theory that you just shared, I guess.
I think in terms of prompt and engineering, that level of specificity is really important. So you would have to be specific about all the different elements, like where is the shop, how old is the customer. It would depend on if the customer is an 80-year-old lady or a 4-year-old boy.
Right, yeah.
You would also want to, I mean, you theoretically could add in things like the cultural script. So you could say, use this script to come up with a response.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
So you could provide it as a template. You could say, based on this idea to request by, or say that you want something by saying, I want you to give me something. I don't know if you will do it. Please provide an appropriate response.
That's interesting. But then also, as you were saying before, for one interaction, we need more than one cultural script. So also, if there would be like some way of like automating which cultural scripts you should use, you know, like more like I'm thinking more like a RAG kind of thing, like where the model has access to like a database or like a list of cultural scripts that are annotated by X. Yeah, that maybe it's like a bigger project, but still, I think this could be like super interesting.
The knowledge base that I showed what
Yeah.
ChatGPT gave me, that was a RAG database
Okay.
structure.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, there are a few different ways that you could do it, but I think there's no way of avoiding basically building a kind of database like this, and just trying to be as detailed and nuanced as possible. The problem, of course, is the man hours and how much has to be done by humans before we can have AI do it effectively by itself, which is an interesting experiment on its own, I think.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, we just put it out there. The audience has been a bit quiet, but like maybe the people that's gonna rewatch this are gonna have ideas, or will have like basically ideas or like projects or interest in taking this up. Let's see.
Yeah, I hope so. And people are welcome to find me on LinkedIn and ask more questions of me in person.
Great, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
So later we're going to. Are you okay with sharing your slides so we can share it with the audience later?
Yes, of course.
Because I think like a lot of examples that you showed, I mean, you were not talking about like I don't know, like a culture in Latin America in particular, but I think it could be adapted. Like they can take your examples and just go from there, which definitely helps. I think like one of the most difficult things is to start with something, and since maybe this is a bit more linguistic, so I can imagine that someone that doesn't have a strong background in linguistics or is not familiar with this theory will struggle with like where to start. But if they take your examples, like I think they can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some really good work done by Susana Fernandez and a few others like Jan Hein on Spanish, and their writing is very understandable, and you don't need a deep linguistic background to get into their work. So I would highly recommend that work for people working in Spanish as well.
You said Susana Fernandez?
Yes.
We can look for it. Something else, because that's quite a... I mean, it's not a Lauren Sadow, let's say, kind of thing. So the co-authors maybe, or the title of a paper, or a title of something, we could a bit more easily find their work.
Yes, give me 2 seconds and I'll find the title of the paper.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
So this particular one is open access. I'll find the link to it.
The title's also fine.
The title is Cognitive Cultural Semantics, a Nordic Guide to Natural Semantic Metalanguage.
Well, okay, I'll just read.
It does look at it's got the no, it doesn't have Spanish.
That's perfect. We can just rewatch the video and note down the title.
Let me see if Susana has one of her Spanish ones. And then I won't give you the title because my Spanish is terrible. Oh, Jan Hein has a paper on lunfardo. No, that's porteño.
Bueno, no sé, ¿quieres agregar algo mientras en español, María? En resumen.
En resumen, bueno, pues que espero que a todo el mundo le haya encantado esta charla. Si tenéis dudas porque hay alguna parte en la que os habéis perdido, porque al final eran conceptos de lingüística que seguramente eran extraños para mucha gente, para mí la primera. Lauren nos ha dicho que le podemos hacer preguntas, entonces adelante, no os quedéis con dudas y sobre todo nos va a compartir un par de papers de estos temas adaptados al español que también compartiremos con todo el mundo. Entonces, bueno, espero que vayan los proyectos súper bien y no sé, que también nos sirva esta charla para coger inspiración. Diana, ¿quieres añadir algo?
Pues, o sea, resaltar que sí, definitivamente, o sea, la plática tiene a lo mejor un poco, pues, está bastante más orientada a lingüística. O sea, lo que nos presentó Lauren al final es una teoría que viene de lingüística. Entonces, por eso, pues, se hizo referencia a muchos conceptos de esa área. Pero yo creo que la manera fácil de resumirlo es que, o sea, en lingüística, el tema de la cultura y el tema de cómo la cultura tiene una influencia en cómo nos comunicamos es algo que, o sea, eso no es nuevo, es algo que ya se ha explorado. Y esta teoría lingüística es una propuesta de cómo modelar eso. Entonces, creo que eso ayuda bastante para no tener que estar invirtiendo tiempo en pensar en cómo hacer para que los modelos puedan entender la cultura. O sea, esta metodología ya tiene ciertas propuestas, la parte de los conceptos, la parte de los scripts que le llaman, que es cómo definir situaciones. Y pues eso creo que es como un buen lugar para empezar. Entonces, o sea, Laure nos va a compartir sus diapositivas. En las diapositivas ella estuvo dando algunos ejemplos. Por ejemplo, ella ha trabajado con la parte cultural de adaptar, o sea, de lo que tiene, de cómo hace influencia la cultura de Australia o sea, en la parte del inglés, aunque está el inglés de Estados Unidos y el inglés en otros países, la parte en cómo se comunican tiene que ver con la cultura. Entonces, en alguna de las diapositivas creo que puso en paralelo cómo cambiaba un poco dependiendo de cuál era la variación del inglés que se utilizaba. Y bueno, esos ejemplos que ella mostró, que aunque estuvieran en inglés, seguramente se pueden utilizar para adaptarlos al tema del español. Así es que, pues eso, no sé qué más decir.
Nada.
Sorry, Lauren, I tried to summarize your talk in a couple of minutes, and I didn't do it as well as you did, but at least I thought I was able to convey the main idea, so people can look.
From what I understood, it was great.
Okay, then I'm happy with that.
Great. Then thank you very much, Laura, for the presentation, Diana also for the discussion and summing up, and everybody for listening. So, bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.